talk about something similar. So the first topic for today is going to be neo-McCarthyism and why NATO should not exist. So for those who don't know, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this organization essentially comprises the United States and Europe and some other countries in Central and South America. But for the most part, it is the European nations, European Economic Area, with the exception of some Eastern countries and the United States. So where did NATO come from? Why is NATO a thing? So NATO exists essentially as a counterbalance to the Eastern Bloc nations. So during the Cold War, so after World War II ends in 1945, essentially the alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States was one of convenience, right? They are both fighting the Nazis, and it was good for them to be allies in that moment. But afterwards, the communist-capitalist divide ripped that alliance apart. And in fact, there were power plays during the war going on to make sure that communism didn't spread or that capitalism didn't spread or what have you, right? The greatest and most tragic example of this is what happened to Korea. Korea was split in two because as Soviet forces were liberating it from the Japanese Empire, the US forces were also liberating it from the Japanese Empire from opposite ends, right? Russia was coming from the north, the United States was coming from the sea and from the south. And of course, the line drawn at the 38th parallel, what we now know as the demilitarized zone in Korea, divided the nation up until this very day, of course, causing lots of strife and endless amounts of problems there. So this kind of posturing would ultimately lead to the Cold War. And the Cold War was really about spreading your ideology and your influence around. I don't want to get into all the nuances of the Cold War, but suffice it to say that in this kind of spread of influence, in this rush to create zones of influence, spheres of influence as they were called, and usually they were along hemispheric lines with the exception of Europe, NATO was formed by the United States for these kind of capitalist countries to exist in a space that was sufficiently anti-communist. And whether it was a good idea or a bad idea for NATO to exist at the time is not really mine to say right now. But what I will say is that definitively the Cold War ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed under Gorbachev, and essentially, the Western Bloc, the Eastern Bloc nations broke free from the Soviet Union, which became the Russian Federation, right? And NATO just kind of went back to being a bunch of European powers who had an agenda in the region and had a military alliance with each other. The idea was effectively that if any of us get attacked, all of us have been attacked, and we'll fight that way. There was very little reality behind this notion. The Soviet Union was not going to just attack Germany or attack France. It really wasn't the way this was going to go. But the NATO was a show of force, right? It was a show of force against Russia. And it may have made sense during the Cold War, but again, the Cold War ended in 1991, right? There's no real reason for this body to be around except to further this neo-McCarthyite ideology. So what is McCarthyism, right? So in the United States, during the Cold War, there was this politician named McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy. I do not believe he's related to Kevin McCarthy, the current minority leader in the House. I don't think they're related. So, sever that tie in your brain. So Joe McCarthy essentially made his political fame by what we would now call red baiting. Essentially to say that, the liberals in Hollywood are communist, and essentially he had denouncement lists. And if you were on one of these lists, you could lose your job, your career, any social standing you had. And so essentially, this was a witch hunt, and I really mean that in the traditional sense, right? Very much like what happened in Salem. He just pointed and he said, you're a communist, and if you couldn't disprove that you were a communist, the thing that you could do to save yourself was to rat out other communists, right? So what ended up happening was, people would accuse each other, and other people would accuse other people, and And people went to jail for this. People went to prison for allegedly being communists with almost no proof. People lost their careers, had their lives ruined because allegedly they were communists. And it's not to say there weren't any communists in the U.S. at the time, but the people who were being accused were just people of power and influence. They weren't really communists. And a lot of times it had to do with like Hollywood and people in the media and people who most definitely were not communists. If anything, they were probably corporate capitalists. But that aside, this is kind of the McCarthyism has come to mean the baseless hating of anything Russian or Russian related. So it was Soviet or Soviet related, but now we would think of it as being Russian or Russian related. And, when you think of when there are issues in the United States, who gets blamed, right? So the reason I call this is called neo-McCarthyism is because in the modern era, what we have gone back to doing is blaming Russia for the problems that we see. Election meddling, all sorts of other things, cyber attacks, and all this other stuff, that it's alleged that the Russian government is involved with. And there's this idea that, nothing gets done in Russia without Putin being aware of it or signing off with it, which is really a ridiculous notion. I mean, think about the United States. Does nothing happen in the U.S. without Joe Biden say so? No, of course not. I'm doing this show. I didn't ask Joe Biden permission, right? I didn't ask the FBI for permission to do this. And you kind of, you've created this culture where, everything's run through Putin. You create this giant conspiracy for which there is really no evidence, right? It's true that Putin is an authoritarian and he has lots of power and lots of control, but the truth is, the idea that nothing goes on in Russia without his say-so is naive. It's childish. It's just wrong, right? So this idea that we can attribute everything that goes on in Russia or from Russia or even around Russia to the Kremlin, is similarly naive. And that's where this McCarthyism is leading us, right? Every little thing that goes wrong, every little cyber attack, right? I'm sure there are hackers in Russia who don't talk to Putin, who just hack people for fun or whatever. There are hackers in America, there are hackers in China, there are hackers in India, there's hackers everywhere, right? Hacking is a thing that people all over the world can do. You don't need to be in any particular country or practicing any particular type of government for that. So anyway, to get back to the original point here of neo-McCarthyism, so this tendency of U.S. media and U.S. politicians to blame all of our woes on the Russian Federation is this neo-McCarthyism, right? So I hope I've established that, even though I kind of jumped around a little bit. So what does this have to do with NATO? Why is it that NATO shouldn't exist? Well, NATO shouldn't exist, first of all, because obviously tensions have in theory cooled down since 1991, with the exception of this neo-McCarthyite language that I spoke of earlier. And NATO really exists to antagonize Russia. It always has, right? Even in the Soviet era, the purpose was to say, don't you dare do anything we don't like because we'll all come after you, right? It was an intimidation tactic by the United States and their European allies to antagonize Russia or to subdue Russia and stop Russia from doing things it didn't like. It serves the same purpose today, right? If we really wanted world peace, we really wanted de-escalation, and we really wanted denuclearization, then we would be dismantling NATO. We would be, welcoming the Russians into newfound alliances and try and create a positive and less hostile environment for this other nuclear armed power, right? But, by accusing them of these things that they likely didn't do and creating this atmosphere where Russia and specifically the Russian government is to blame for everything, you kind of keep those tensions high. You reinforce the need for an organization like NATO, whose real purpose isn't really anything. It's a defensive organization. It was created because they thought that their members might be attacked by the Russians, and in that form, the Soviet Union. But that's not going to happen. It's not likely. There's nothing about that. And even so, because of the way that nuclear weapons exist around the world, the likelihood that Europe attacks Russia or vice versa, it's just unlikely. All these nations have nukes. There's no good reason for NATO to exist, except for to continue to antagonize Russia and to continue to create a space where people who buy and sell weapons can get very rich, and people who make their money off of fear-mongering against these kind of fog of war powers can get very rich. And that's what's happened. So to kind of bring this segment to an end, and again, I've been rambling a lot, so I apologize for that, but hopefully this all makes sense, is that we live in an era now where we have so many larger problems. We have other things going on. We don't need to spend our time and our energy and our money antagonizing another nuclear-armed power. We just don't need to do that. Does Russia always behave the way we want it to? No. Do we always behave the way Russia wants to? No, of course not. That's part of international relations. That's just how countries operate. And we have peaceable ways to get the other country to come to the table. For example, Russia and the US recently had a tiff over something, I'm forgetting what it was, but they withdrew their ambassadors, right? So this got other people nervous, and they said, hey, US, you should talk to Russia. Hey, Russia, you should talk to US. And they met and they talked, and you know what the conclusion was? Their ambassadors are back, right? So this was a way that didn't involve war, that didn't involve NATO, that didn't involve McCarthyism, to get two nations who were having a disagreement to talk to each other. And we can continue to do that. We don't need these scary organizations. And I mean scary like for us, regular people too, because these are a bunch of people with big red buttons who are less afraid than they should be to press them. So at the end of the day, we have better ways, we have better ways to work things out, and we have more important objectives to address than this back and forth antagonism that we have been engaging in with the Russian Federation. And I hope that this segment has given you a little bit of insight as to why that's the case and what we can do to stop this mutual antagonism. And the primary effort for that would be to abolish NATO.